Recording in progress.
No more, but
Hey, Toby.
Hold on.
You're welcome to start, Morgan.
Well, welcome to everyone for tonight's session, which will be talking about Canada's nuclear story. I'm Morgan Brown, and I will share my screen. Okay, and hopefully you can all see that. So tonight's topic is a lecture I've been giving to both universities and also interested groups, and also professionally at work. I've given this, and it's talking about Canada's nuclear journey. It's a history lesson, but it's fascinating history.
Sorry, Morgan, can you unmute your mic, please?
Okay. Unmute again. I'd already done so. Anyway, I'm Morgan Brown, if you hadn't caught any of that previous to that. And I'll be talking about Canada's nuclear journey. It's a lecture I've been giving over the past few years, both professionally to work colleagues, but also to outside groups, a variety of them. The lecture changes all the time as I update things and get new information. Aside from being a professional engineer, I'm a fellow of the Canadian Nuclear Society, and I'm also president of a mouthful called the Society for the Preservation of Canada's Nuclear Heritage Incorporated, and we're trying to preserve some of our own history. And I was a research engineer up until January when I retired from Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. I have researcher emeritus status, and so I can still do some research work there, both for my history side of things, but also with severe accidents, which I worked in for many years. And I'd like to give credit to Jeremy Whitlock, formerly of Atomic Energy, but he's with the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, and he had created a lot of this in the early years. Anyway, this was his presentation. Our society would like to acknowledge that this event is being held on traditional and unceded lands of Anishinaabe and Algonquin First Nations. And in fact, there's a little bit of a tie in this picture here, because this is the log home here in Deep River of David and Mary Adams. They were an Algonquin couple. They built this cabin. It's the last one of, there were about 7 or 8 in Deep River area. And the families living there, they do logging and small-time farming and things like this, but their land and their homes were expropriated when Deep River was made the bedroom community for what became the Chalk River Nuclear Laboratories. This happened in 1945 or 44, that their land was expropriated. And as part of the whole business of truth and reconciliation, it's good that we acknowledge things that have happened in our past. So why would we bother learning nuclear history? Well, it's mighty interesting for techies like myself. Interesting little things like here's a nuclear a radioisotope thermal generating based weather station up in the Arctic, Axel Heiberg Island. It was built by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, and it was up there for 3 years. Atomic Energy of Canada Limited also was into radioisotope thermal generators, and they built one for the Brockville Lighthouse. Lasted for a couple of years. Did you realize that the Richfield Oil Corporation in the early 1960s, they were proposing to use nuclear explosives for the oil sands? You know, you wonder what would have happened if that had happened. Not a good idea in my view. You might learn something, and this is very important for us engineers, is learning from things that have happened in the past, and you know why things were done, but also what went wrong, small incidents or big incidents, big accidents, in fact. And so you have NRX and NRU research reactors. Pickering Unit 2 had 2 accidents, both relatively small, but had significance for our Canadian nuclear industry. Bruce fueling machine, Bruce 2 had a cold channel failure. There was an E-beam radiation therapy for cancer, the Therac 25, and there were programming errors, and they actually led to deaths. 2 or 3 people died because they got a terribly high dose. We had 3 Mile Island, SL1 down in Idaho, Chernobyl 4, huge accident, the worst yet by far. You had 4 accidents essentially at Fukushima Daiichi, and then that was in 2011. We had incidents like turbine drops at Bruce A onto concrete, at Point Lepreau, dropped the fresh new turbine into seawater in St. John Harbor. You have designs, you know, what have been successes, what have been failures, what had never had the chance to be tested out. All sorts of different reactor designs, the intense neutron generator, the ING project, never went anywhere. There are also processes that we can learn from. So there's the Bruce 2 steam generator had a lead blanket in it, and it was sealed up, and the reactor was restarted, and it all sorts, you know, they found the remnants of the blanket, and it caused all sorts of corrosion problems with lead throughout the primary heat transport system. There were problems with the Point Lepreau retube. It wasn't verified correctly, and they went ahead and did all sorts of retubing and then had to redo the lot of it because it wasn't verified correctly. There were some abandoned radium-based paints in a Toronto warehouse in 1961. Some kids broke in and got contaminated themselves. No long-term problem with it, but at the same time, lack of materials control. And finally, perhaps the worst of these in many respects was how the Canada-India reactor, Cyrus, built as a copy of the NRX accident, NRX reactor in Chalk River. The Indians to whom it was sold under the Commonwealth program, the Colombo plan, they used that reactor, even though it had some basic safeguards, but they used it to produce plutonium, and then blew up a bomb in the desert in 1974. They cynically called it Operation Smiling Buddha. So that was a proliferation process. So these kind of things, history, we can learn from. It's not just because it's fun to, which it is in my view, but we can learn from it, and we should. Here's an example. In 1847, a doctor in the United States, he reported on a uranium mineral specimen that was found on the shore of Lake Superior. And it was found by a schooner captain who went ashore and happened to find this stuff. Anyway, this new ore of uranium was written up in 1847. This is before radiation was known. 100 years later, a prospector looking for uranium that was now important, he used the article that had been written 100 years before as a guide, and he found a deposit of uranium on the north shore, north of Sault Ste. Marie. So don't underestimate libraries. Don't underestimate what's hidden in the past. And it turned into a uranium mine, a small one, but nonetheless, it produced results. You might correct a wrong with history. This fellow, Stephen Whelan, he was a utility worker at the Chalk River site, and he died in a chemical explosion in 1950 in December. And it was ammonium nitrate that exploded. It was in an evaporator. They were trying to reduce the volume. and it's the only industrial accident death at Chalk River. The Whelan family were unsure what had happened. They felt poorly treated and forgotten. And decades later, some Chalk River communication staff, they were in a mall in Pembroke nearby. They had a table there and showing all this wonderful stuff that we could do at Chalk River. They were ashamed and embarrassed when someone said, "Has anyone ever died at the plant?" And they went, "No," because they didn't know of anyone. And this person said, "Well, my father was killed." And it was evidently Sarah, whose father was Stephen Whelan. We heard of this story with the Chalk River communications staff, and three of us with the Canadian Nuclear Society, we went and contacted the family. We just happened to find the connection of who was who in this family. And we visited Rita, who was the widow, and there were family and friends. There were actually a couple of guys who'd been in the accident itself. We had a wonderful time at lunch one day in 2009. And what was really astonishing to me was Rita asked me, she said, "Well, did Stephen, her husband, did he cause the accident?" She thought maybe he did, whatever, and no one had corrected her. I told her absolutely not. He was not responsible for the accident. She'd lived 58 years thinking he was. The family later visited where Stephen died, and Rita died in 2017. She had remarried and had other children, but nonetheless, it was a terrible accident, a terrible, first start in her life. So there's Stephen and Rita on their wedding day, and I love this photo which came into our collection fairly recently, and that's Stephen and Rita on the right-hand side at an opening of a club in town in Deep River. And I think it's very charming. And real people, real stories. Again, you might correct a wrong. In this case, it's a graph, and you can see the pink lines were predicted production of Canada's nuclear reactors, how they do over the years. And I took that plot and then I've plotted the actual results. And I've used this to illustrate to people that you have to be very careful making predictions to the future. And also, it's a good way of showing that CANDU reactors in Canada, the ones here, have continued to produce an awful lot of electricity. The recent decline is actually due to several reactors being shut down for refurbishment. There are a number of Canadian nuclear history books. Some are more technical than others, but a lot of them are just good reads. And the one right in the middle is Montréal et Le Vent, which was produced or written by Gilles Sabarin. It's also an English version. And that came out, was it last year, I think? And that's talking about the early laboratory, the Montreal laboratories, which I'll get into later. So there's some good reading there. Canada's Nuclear Story is sort of the classic, written by Wilfred Eggleston, who's a professor in journalism at Carleton University, and he wrote an exceedingly good story of the early years up to 1965. So let's go back to the beginning, nuclear history. Well, 6.5 billion years ago, uranium was formed in a supernova, along with all the other heavy elements. About 1.8 billion years ago, there was a natural reactor that occurred at a place, Oklo, in what's now Gabon. And is actually a great analog for waste disposal, or the lack of movement of fission products. They haven't moved very far at all in this natural reactor, which probably operated over the course of 100,000 years or so. Moving ahead in time, 1789, this fellow in Germany, Martin Klaproth, he discovered both uranium and zirconium in the same year. It's just absolutely astonishing that he did that. Just happened to be that he was available. There were still a lot of undiscovered elements at the time. Both of those metals are exceedingly important to the nuclear, but no one even knew about radiation at the time. So the early days of actual radiation work, physics, began 1895, November 8th. And this fellow in Germany, William Röntgen, discovered what became known as X-rays. he really didn't want them called Röntgen rays, even though some people insisted on that. The first Canadian diagnostic radiograph was actually 1896, February 7th, 3 months later. And it showed the surgeons in Montreal, it showed the location of a bullet in Tolson Cunning's leg. He had been shot on Christmas Day. And they'd been probing for the bullet, hadn't found it. His leg was saved. 1896, just a few weeks later, Henri Becquerel discovered radioactivity in uranium, these strange new rays that were coming out of rock. And in 1898, Marie Sklodowska and her husband Pierre Curie, they extracted polonium. They discovered and extracted a small quantity of plutonium in July and radium in December from pitchblende, this uranium ore. Radium features quite a lot in our story coming up. Now, this fellow, Ernest Rutherford, a brilliant physicist, he was born and his earlier education in college was in New Zealand. He's claimed by New Zealand, Canada, and the UK because he contributed a great deal in all three countries. In 1898, he moved from Britain, where he'd done more training at university, and he became the professor of physics at McGill University. He was there for 8 years, 9 years maybe, 8.5. And he worked with Frederick Soddy, who was also from Britain. And during that time, Rutherford did some tremendous work with radiation and radioactivity. And in fact, in 1908, he'd moved back to Britain to take a professorship there, and he was awarded the Nobel Prize, and it was for work done in Canada. So there he is in McGill on the steps, 1905. He was both a highly respected man, but also highly respectful of others. 1910, nuclear structure of the atom he described, and later began artificial transmutation, changing an element from nitrogen to oxygen in this case. You could actually, by bombarding with alpha particles, in this case, you could actually knock out parts of atoms and end up with new substance. Fascinating stuff. Interestingly, in that 1905 picture, there's Otto Hahn, who was a young student at the time, and he unknowingly demonstrated nuclear fission with Fritz Strassmann in Berlin in 1939. He sent his unexplained chemical results to Lise Meitner, who had been a colleague of his in Berlin, and Lise and her nephew Otto Frisch actually took those results, developed nuclear fission theory, splitting the uranium atom. And sadly, the Nobel Committee ignored the contribution of Meitner and Frisch, even though they awarded Hahn and Strassmann with the Nobel Prize in 1945, I believe. Rutherford, as I said, he respected people a great deal, and he had a great deal of respect for Harriet Brooks, who was one of his students. She was the first woman nuclear physicist in Canada, and she actually became a valued colleague of Rutherford's while at McGill. She wrote papers, 1 or 2 papers of her own under her own name, and she also wrote papers with Rutherford. And I'm very happy to note that we've named a lab at Chalk River, the Harriet Brooks Building, in her honor. Rutherford, early on, had great ideas, and this is while he was at McGill. If it was ever possible to control at will the rate of disintegration of the radio elements, an enormous amount of energy could be obtained from a small amount of matter. Interestingly, later on, Rutherford also poo-pooed the ideas of nuclear fission producing usable quantities of energy. But certainly early on, he was very much convinced of it. He had lots of honors aside from Nobel Prizes. And I'm a rail enthusiast, and especially English locomotives, and you have one named after you, that is an honor. In 1930, Gilbert and his brother Charles Labine, both from Westmeath, Ontario, which is about 70 kilometers from the Chalk River Labs, they discovered a uranium deposit up at Great Bear Lake in Northwest Territories. They were looking for uranium because of its daughter product, its offspring, which a small amount of radium in the uranium decay chain. radium is highly radioactive, and it's produced in very, very small quantities. But it's useful. At that time, it was the only substance that could really produce strong gamma rays for being emitted the whole time, that they could penetrate into a person and could actually irradiate a cancer. So there's their mine and someone undergoing treatment with radium. It was worth something in the order of $100,000 per gram at the time in radium, but it was highly radioactive, so you didn't need much. It was also useful when you added it to paints, because it could create glow-in-the-dark paints, and that's a whole other story, but it was very useful for painting both watch faces and also for aircraft instruments. They founded the El Dorado refinery in Port Hope, Ontario in 1933. And there they processed the uranium, especially to remove the radium. The uranium itself was essentially a waste product at that time, and they disposed of it accordingly. And both the waste rock and uranium were spread around Port Hope area, and that's led to a couple of cleanup projects since then. One's ongoing right now with Canadian Nuclear Labs leading that. I couldn't help but throw this in. That's the El Dorado Silver Radium Express, a Belanca air cruiser, which is preserved in the Royal Aviation Museum in Western Canada. I took that picture a few months ago, and there it is in service. And that used to fly bags of uranium ore concentrate down to Edmonton, and then it was taken to the Port Hope refinery from there. Now, Canada is well known for its uranium deposits, especially in Saskatchewan. They don't mine it in the Northwest Territories anymore. Cigar Lake in Saskatchewan has the highest grade ore in the world. And the planned output in 2022 made it the largest single uranium operation in the world. And over the last few years, it's changed the percentages, but between 8 and 22% of the world supply of U3O8 comes from Canada, from Saskatchewan mines, and second to Kazakhstan. In 1932, James Chadwick in England, he discovered the neutron, this neutral particle in atoms. And the question then arose, well, these neutrons fly out of various nuclear events. What happens when you bombard something with neutrons? Leo Szilard actually conceived of the possibility in mid-1930s, he conceived of a possibility of controlled atomic chain reaction. He didn't know what it was. It turned out to be uranium, especially uranium-235. He conceived of the possibility of this chain reaction continuing, and that you could actually get something useful out of nuclear reactions because of the neutrons. Chadwick also won the Nobel Prize. In 1939, in January, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, working in Berlin, they came up with some bizarre results. They were bombarding uranium with neutrons, and they came up with these pieces which they couldn't understand. They were leftover elements, and they were expecting things to be heavier than uranium. You're adding neutrons, surely you get heavier. They've seen this before with other elements. You add neutrons and you get heavier elements. But in this case, they were actually getting some lighter particles like barium. So they didn't understand what was going on. So they wrote off, or Otto Hahn especially wrote off to their former colleague, Lise Meitner, who they both really respected a great deal. Lise had escaped to Stockholm. In fact, I think Otto Hahn had helped her get out of the country. She had escaped because she had Jewish heritage, and the Nazis were after anyone of Jewish blood, Jewish heritage. So she went there, and with these results that Hahn and Strassmann had sent, she discussed things with Otto Frisch, her nephew, who was in the Institute of Theoretical Physics at Copenhagen. They went out for a ski and a walk together, and they realized what was happening was actually the uranium atom was splitting apart and providing neutrons. So they wrote a letter to Nature, which was published in February 1939, and it announced to the world that this really happened. Wow, this caused a huge buzz. Immediately, people were experimenting around the world as soon as they had read this very short and concise letter. They were experimenting but with bombarding uranium and getting the same results. So this was a whole new world of nuclear physics being opened up. And then war came. And war shut down the communication between these physicists and chemists around the world. It stopped papers from being written and disseminated, because each country actually then, or a lot of countries, realized there was a potential, because of the energy released from one uranium atom split, millions of times more than one carbon atom being burned with oxygen. These countries realized there was actually a military importance to it. And so they became much more secretive. In 1940, these three men in Collège de France in Paris, Frédéric Joliot-Curie, he was the son-in-law of Marie and Pierre. He'd married Irene Curie, who was also a chemist, I believe. Anyway, Frédéric Joliot-Curie, he ran this lab, and Hans von Halban worked with him. He became the first Canadian lab director. And there was Lou Kowarski, who actually was the brilliance, the physics mind behind the first reactor built outside the United States, Zero Energy Experimental Power. But that's coming. Nonetheless, these three were working in Paris. They were working with fission. They knew something would work as a moderator to slow down neutrons, which was actually very important to having a progression, a chain reaction with uranium. This heavy water had been discovered only in 1931 or 32, and it was produced in one plant in the world, and that was a hydro plant in Vemork in Norway. They were producing it in 1935, and it was generally heavy water. It was produced as part of making ammonia for producing fertilizers. But this plant, a small byproduct of it, they set up some extra cells there. I forget the name of the brilliant Norwegian who set this up to produce heavy water. And it was generally just a scientific curiosity, but people around the world, there was enough demand for it to keep it in operation. Nonetheless, these three Frenchmen persuaded the French government. They actually sent one man, Dallier, I think it was, up there to Norsk Hydro and persuaded them to either loan or sell the world's stock of heavy water for this lab. And that the war is going on. Norway is neutral. France is at war with Germany. And anyway, this stock, there was a bit of subterfuge there, because two aircraft were sent, one aircraft carrying this heavy water, and Dallier landed in Scotland, and then from there moved to France. But the other aircraft they set up, it was a ruse, and actually the Germans forced it down in Hamburg and found nothing aboard it. That world stock of heavy water, which they then had been using in Collège de France, it was moved by the Collier Broom Park, and with Lou Kowarski and von Halban on board with their families, it was moved to Britain in June 1940 as the Nazis were invading France. And actually, Frédéric Joliot-Curie stayed behind in Paris and was part of the resistance during the war. That same drum of water, whilst it was used at Cambridge for experiments there with von Halban and Kowarski, it actually got shipped to Canada because the labs moved to Canada. And that came here in 1943, the initial stock. And after the war, it returned to France. There have been a few films about the commando operations to attack the Vemork plant, because during the war, the Allies realized that this plant was being used to produce heavy water for the German nuclear program. They thought the Germans were well ahead on things. They turned out not to be. There is a semi-correct 2015 miniseries called The Heavy Water War, and there are several other older films, all of them dubious historical content, but that one was fairly good in 2015. And my favorite artifact in our whole collection is actually, we have some paraffin wax with heavy hydrogen that came from Norsk Hydro, and it was relabeled in July 1946. So we had it here, and it even says it's from Norsk Hydro. So I love that link to all this history that's fascinating. Actually, some of it was worthy of James Bond, some of those commando operations. In 2018, the Royal Society in Britain discovered actually this letter. And interestingly enough, it's about a paper by Dr. Halbon and Dr. Kowarski, and it was signed by James Chadwick. So I just found that a really interesting, and it was actually a suppression of the paper in that time. I don't know why there's a red streak on your what you're seeing, I think. Dear. Anyway, in 1941-42, this fellow, born in Charlottetown, PEI, George Lawrence, he was working at the National Research Council in Ottawa. He knew of fission, of course, and he was experimenting with a subcritical nuclear pile there. There was essentially the scale size. There were some papers he wrote about it. His work was known, which was fascinating. And he worked with a fellow, Bernie Sargent from Queen's University. He wrote several papers here. He worked after hours. It was secretive. He was getting himself covered in graphite because the core had uranium in it, and it also had graphite power, because graphite was known to be a good moderator at slowing down neutrons, which helps make the reactions better for uranium. Anyway, his work, his core, there was too many impurities in the carbon and in actually the uranium as well. He didn't know that, but it was first experiments, and they took place in Ottawa. Just amazing that this work was being done at that time. So meanwhile, in 1940, in the UK, all those scientists from Europe who had escaped Nazi Europe, they continued their work at Cambridge University, and the Maud Committee in the UK examined the atomic weapon possibility. In December 1940, plutonium was produced and isolated at the University of California by Seaborg and Macmillan. And in 1941 December, the Maud Committee concluded that an atom bomb and a heavy water boiler, as they called it, or a reactor, it was feasible, but with Commonwealth help. They felt they could not do it in Britain. And so the Tube Alloys Project, as it was called, was set up. And at the time, the UK was known to be well ahead of everyone in uranium research. This is 1941 December. Pearl Harbor happened that same month. And you can see that the US moved very rapidly, and the Manhattan Project, the Manhattan Engineering Project, it began in Manhattan, New York, was officially set up in September 1st, 1942, even though it was already percolating away and being established. And they proposed to move the UK heavy water team to Montreal with National Research Council of Canada, with their oversight and paying the bill. In August 17th, 1942, this man, Clarence Decatur Howe, or Decatur Howe, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. He was the Minister of Everything. You might recognize him from the C.D. Howe Institute, for instance. And he said, okay, let's go with this project. Let's bring these Europeans and all their technology to Canada. And you can see after the war, there's a picture of in August 1945, the war in Japan was still going on at this time, but probably the atom bomb had been dropped. You can see George Lawrence on the left. He became the third president of the Atomic Energy Control Board. Next is C.J. Mackenzie, Chalmers Jack Mackenzie, who was NRC's third president and became the second president of the Atomic Energy Control Board. C.D. Howe next to him. And on the right-hand side is John Cockcroft, who was the second lab director here in Canada. So south of the border, though, while all this was going on, rolling back a few years, you had Enrico Fermi, who was a refugee from Italy because of the fascists. He left Italy because his wife, Laura, was Jewish. And his team actually built the first nuclear reactor, human-built nuclear reactor in the world, which went critical in Chicago, December 2nd, 1942. And there's his team. In 1943, the Montreal laboratories were now established. These European scientists had come over, joined by some Canadians, joined by some British scientists, working on this whole project about, splitting the uranium atom. You have George Lawrence again, and his buddy Bernard Sargent from Queens. There's Hans van Halben, who was the director at the time, this laboratory. There's John Cockcroft, who became the second lab director. He was visiting the labs at the time. Hans van Halben, they didn't get on very well with. Anyway, there's Jules Guérin from France. And he'd misplaced a couple of samples of uranium-233 and 235. They searched everywhere, couldn't figure it out. These were minuscule amounts that the Americans had given the Canadian project. There's Bertrand Goldschmidt. He developed the Trigley process for plutonium extraction. And Alan Nunn-May, you may have heard of him. He was a spy for the Soviets, British physicist, and the samples of U-233 and 235 that disappeared, he'd actually given to the Soviets. And after the war, it was revealed, right as the war was ending there, just after, in September, that was the Guzenko affair, the cipher clerk in the USSR embassy in Ottawa. And he spilled the beans on the things that were going on in Chalk River. Bruno Pontecorvo was a brilliant physicist, originally from Italy, and he ended up defecting to the Soviet Union. But was he a spy? Certainly Bertrand Goldschmidt says absolutely not. Anyway, there's an interesting story, quite the character, apparently a very good tennis player, also liked the ladies. Anyway, those are some of the members of this team of fairly ambitious, fairly young, very bright people in Montreal. In January 1943, the chair of the U.S. National Defense Research Committee wrote to Chalmers Jack Mackenzie at the NRC of Canada, and he said, well, the Montreal group, okay, they will focus on heavy water to assist the Manhattan Project. But the Manhattan Project will not give the Canadian group any information about the methods of extraction of element 49, that is plutonium, nor designing the plant, the reactor, nor the methods for preparing heavy water. Like, what gives here? That was just amazing that they're supposed to work on this, but all that the Americans had already discovered, they weren't going to share. The Americans had big worries about nuclear research and also post-war commercialization. They were worried about the German nuclear research. They were worried about security. They were worried about all these, Europeans working with the British and the Canadians. They were suspicious. They weren't under the U.S. Army security that the Manhattan Project was. The U.S. was by far the biggest contributor to Manhattan Project. So, restrictions were later eased somewhat, but Canada's contribution was quite small. However, we were now focusing on heavy water. And so back in 1939, it was known to be the best moderator in theory. There was a plant built similar to the North Hydro plant, but it was built in Trail, BC by Cominco. The US government had actually signed this contract with them. The Canadian government didn't know this had happened. Chicago pile number 3 was the first in the world with D2O, heavy water, and natural uranium. And it went critical first time in May 1944. And actually, Walter Zinn was in directing the construction. He became very, very important, I think, especially with the argon labs in the United States. He happened to be Canadian born, but had gone down south. By this time, though, graphite reactors were showing their real potential, and the Americans said, we're going to focus on graphite, so we'll let the Canadians explore heavy water. And they set the course for us. And so combined policy committee decision in April 1944, they said they should build a heavy water plant in Canada for plutonium production. And they selected the site in August 1944. And that site was what's known as Chalk River. I live in Deep River, which is the bedroom community of Chalk River laboratories. So there are some first pictures in the fall of 1944. It was also known as the Petawawa Works. It was being built by Defence Industries Limited, which was an offshoot of Canadian Industries Limited. I think I seem to recall that C.D. Howe, he was an engineer. And there was some kind of potential link between him and some of this work, but that's as much as I know, really. In the spring of 1945, you can see the ice on the river still. I think this is probably March. And you can see NRX, the National Research Experimental Reactor. Actually, originally it was the X stood for X metal, which was the code name for uranium. Anyway, that reactor, they're already building the structure for it. And Canada hadn't built a reactor at all at this time. So there are a lot of things actually they didn't know about building the reactor, yet they were still proceeding with designing and constructing it. And so in May 1945, you can see the building has advanced considerably. And in front, there's a barn-like structure, and the zero energy experimental pile was built there because they needed a small reactor to deal with calculations which the Montreal labs, they did a lot of theoretical work leading to the NRX construction, but they still needed some experimental work to confirm some things and also get some exact numbers. And you can see in June 1945, NRX building continues, but the ZEEP building is essentially complete. They're still building the reactor inside. So in 1945, ZEEP, the first reactor built outside of Canada, outside of the United States. It was committed in August 1944, just after they'd committed to Chalk River. It first operated just over a year later, and its final shutdown was 1970. It was a very low power reactor. They call it zero energy, but it was 110 watts, something in that order. Depends on the experiment they did. And they had long fuel rods suspended in a tank of heavy water with shielding around. You can see the left-hand picture there is a picture of you can see the tank in the background. You can see an ion chamber in those large graphite blocks. We have 3 of them in our museum. And on the right is the distinctive barn shape. There's Lou Kowarski, the physicist, the brains behind the design from a physics standpoint. And he was in the Collège de France, you remember? And there on the left side there is George Klein, brilliant man. He sort of took this physics and turned it into practical design. He designed the mechanical side of things, the actual physical plant. I think George Klein built the first electric wheelchair in the world, I believe. ZEEP today, there's a lovely model at Schoolhouse Museum in Laurentian Hills, just up the Ottawa Valley from Deep River. We have small samples from ZEEP enclosed in plastic. These have been available in the past. AECL made probably a few thousand of them, gave them away. We have a model of ZEEP, which I refer to as actually WEEP, the whiskey emitter to entertain parliamentarians. It was given to Ralph Green when he departed from research side to his Central Ottawa ACL office and had to deal with parliamentarians. And we have this lovely model in our office. And yes, it does actually, you put some liquid in the middle and it dispenses, there's a little pump underneath and it dispenses out of a spout. So we thought it must be a whiskey decanter. And there's the actual tank, aluminum tank from ZEEP. and it's in the Museum of Science and Technology in Ottawa. And we'd kind of like to have it back here one day. For the 75th anniversary of ZEEP, a couple of years ago, we prepared a stamp. So it's one of these vanity stamps you buy. But anyway, we very pleased with the outcome of that. Amazingly, in August 1945, after the atom bomb had been dropped on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Nagasaki being a plutonium bomb, Hiroshima being a uranium bomb, there was a press release from the government. And I think in some ways it was the Canadian government waving the flag and saying, we were part of this, we were part of this, even though our contribution was really quite small. The heavy water from Trail there, some scientific data from Montreal lab, but only a small amount really. And also uranium ore, which was mainly from Belgian Congo as it was then, was processed at Port Hope at the El Dorado plant. And it was then shipped down to the United States as uranium metal. However, as they had this huge press release with all sorts of details, but an interesting part of it is that you read through it, there's a section here, Canada's been able to enter as a pioneer into an important new field of technology. The future will disclose the full peacetime potentialities of this remarkable new source of energy. So in 1945, we had the second largest nuclear infrastructure on the planet. The Americans were much, much larger, but we had a lot here. ZEEP worked. And the most powerful research reactor, NRX, was under construction. It went operational in July 1947. Actually, they had to stop working with ZEEP because they needed the heavy water for NRX. We had a limited amount of A-bomb knowledge. We certainly didn't have the expertise here. And bombs are quite difficult to build, despite what some may say. We were experts on heavy water reactors. We had uranium. We have uranium. At the time, they thought it was limited resources. Uranium is actually quite difficult to find. And they believed that uranium-233, coming from thorium, or plutonium-239 was needed as a fissile material to continue operating reactors, to mix in with uranium. And then, thus we have in both NRX and NRU reactors, you had an annulus around the outside of the vessel where they would irradiate thorium. And thorium's code name at the time was J, not X, but J. Canada has focused on peaceful applications of nuclear energy from the beginning. I have yet to come across anything which hints that we were interested in developing weapons for ourselves. I'm very happy for this. So you have NRX reactor on the left-hand side there, operated from 47 to 92. NRU was just shut down 4 years ago, coming out to 5 years ago at the end of this month. And White Shell reactor number 1 out in Manitoba, Pinawa, Manitoba, at the White Shell Nuclear Research Establishment. It operated for 20 years, and it was an organically cooled, heavy water moderated research reactor. It worked exceedingly well. So NRCC became AECL and now is Canadian Nuclear Labs. It's been a long time destination for nuclear research. In 1951, cobalt cancer therapy came along. No longer were we restrained to using radium for treating cancer. And amazingly, within a couple of weeks of each other, 2 separate teams in Canada developed irradiators using cobalt that came from NRX, because we now had a reactor that could create radioisotopes, and they used them for medical purposes. And these 2 separate teams, it was brilliant that they were able to do separate work and yet come up with essentially the same idea. And it was done here in Canada. And amazingly, the Saskatchewan team, Saskatoon specifically, and it was mentioned in the movie about Neil Armstrong. First, I nearly fell out of my seat when I heard in that movie. It was wonderful to hear. In 1952, the National Research Council of Canada's Atomic Project became its own Crown corporation. Came April 1st, the standard date for starts for the fiscal year, the government fiscal year. AECL came into operation at that time. It had been formed a couple of months earlier. We had the Chalk River Laboratories, which had been an NRC division. Well, actually, it was 1946, I think, when it became an NRC division. Before that, it was Defense Industries Limited. But 1952 became AECL, and 2014 became Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. AECL still exists as a small Crown corporation to oversee the contract for running Canadian Nuclear Laboratories. AECL still owns both the White Shell and the Chalk River site. The radiochemical company was formed in 1946, actually as an offshoot from El Dorado, which got turned into a Crown corporation later for uranium mining. But the radiochemical part of it came to AECL, and it was privatized in 1988, and is still operating in the Kanata region in Ottawa. There's the White Shell Labs. It's being decommissioned. It was formed in 1963. And there's the other big division, the the engineering division at Sheridan Park in Mississauga. And it was privatized to SNC-Lavalin in 2011. The 1950s, just a gung-ho go-ahead time, Bertram Brockhouse was doing some work with NRX and his triple axis spectrometer, looking into the heart of matter using a beam of neutrons from the reactor. He won the Nobel Prize for this in 1994, shared with an American who was doing similar work at the time. There's Alan Bromley with a couple of other senior people. Alan Bromley was born in Westmeath, the same place as the Labine brothers who had discovered the uranium mine up in Northwest Territories. Must be something in the water there. Anyway, amongst other things, Alan ended up as a professor at Yale, I think it was, and then he became the science advisor to George Bush Sr. And I happen to know a friend of mine is Alan's nephew. He himself is a research physicist at Chalk River. There's the huge tandem accelerator, which was expanded to become the TASC, Tandem Accelerator. Is there a cyclotron in there? I'm not a physicist. So anyway, world-leading experimental equipment for looking into the heart of matter. What I always find amusing and interesting and puts a real personal spin on things is finding pictures of these famous people doing something less famous than what they're famous for. And this delight to see Bert Brockhouse as a thespian on stage at a regional drama festival in Ontario in 1951 with the Deep River Players. And that theater group is still going. December 12th, 1952, there was a big accident at the National Research Experimental Reactor. And it was the first severe accident in the world. I have spent the last 20 years studying severe accidents. I know a little bit about the NRX accident. Jimmy Carter happened to come up here he was sent up because his boss, Admiral Rickover in the States with the submarine program, asked permission for American servicemen to come up here and help with the cleanup. They arrived here sometime in February or so of 1953. But anyway, back in December 1952, NRX had a significant accident. It went from very low power, they were planning a low power experiment, series of things went wrong, an alignment of things that shouldn't have happened. The reactor went from very low power to about 3 times full power, somewhere in the order of 90 or 100 megawatts thermal, and then back down to low power within, they estimate, 68 seconds. However, it caused 22 of the 176 fuel channels to rupture. There was some uranium melting, and it caused a mess, a mess for cleanup. The accident was halted very promptly, well, within that 68 seconds, because they dumped the moderator and shut off the fission part of the nuclear accident. Initially, it was referred to as a pinhole leak over the telephones to senior AECL people in Ottawa because they didn't know what had happened. There were no injuries, no deaths, of course. It was a major accident, but it need not be a disaster. And they demonstrated that because they rebuilt the reactor, they had cleaned up the area, and they restarted 14 months later. It was just amazing. That accident taught many lessons, especially in the area of reactor safety. For instance, independent, diverse, separated, shutdown systems arose out of that. Canada became a world leader and remains a world leader in reactor safety. George Lawrence was involved, and he was chair of the Reactor Safety Advisory Committee at AECL. But later he actually moved to the Atomic Energy Control Board, which was the predecessor of the current Canadian Nuclear Safety Committee. Council. No, Commission, pardon me. Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. I should know that. Work with people there. It's very interesting that the AECB grew in stature, in capabilities, and in its oversight of the safety, making sure that we were following rules and behaving well. And actually, the corporations themselves, they knew that they had to treat this with a great deal of respect, the whole world of nuclear science and technology. In 1957, the International Atomic Energy Agency was formed, and it grew out of Eisenhower's 1953 Atoms for Peace speech. Atoms up to that time were largely seen as weapons material, weapons production, reactors for producing weapons, which of course was part of the Cold War. But Eisenhower's 1953 Atoms for Peace speech opened the door to sharing nuclear knowledge, and Canada was very instrumental in establishing the IAEA. My friend Jeremy Whitlock is at the IAEA today. 1959, the McMaster nuclear reactor in Hamilton was formed, and today it is now the largest remaining research reactor in Canada, because all the big reactors in Atomic Energy Canada Limited, or CNL, they have been shut down. This reactor is proving very successful. They nearly shut it down a few years ago because I think the university administration was a little wary of it, a little uncertain about what should be done with it. Anyway, it's a tremendous success story, and is used for irradiating samples, for neutron radiography, all sorts of work being done there at McMaster. This man, Wilfred Bennett Lewis, spent World War II actually working on radar technology, very much in the electronics world. However, he was also very familiar with radiation and nuclear science and technology. And he arrived in 1946. John Cockcroft went back to Britain to become the head of the UK nuclear laboratories. W.B. Lewis took his place in charge of R&D. He became known as the father of the CANDU reactor. And he was the driving force behind the application of nuclear science to electricity production using our specialties, which was natural uranium fuel, heavy water moderator. And there's a nice picture of him out camping with, is it Hugh Carmichael? Anyway, in the 1950s, relaxing, frying up some maybe eggs, and also enjoyed going fishing. It's neat to see these other photos. In 1962, nuclear power demonstration, NPD, came online, and it was the first power reactor in Canada at Rolphton, which is about 25 kilometers up the road from me here in Deep River. And there was a big power dam nearby, which was run by the Hydroelectric Power Commission of Ontario. But together with AECL and Canadian General Electric, CGE, in Peterborough, they combined forces and used their own areas of expertise and built this Canada's first power reactor, which was essentially the prototype leading to the CANDU reactor. They expected it to last 10 years, and it lasted 25. It was used as a training center, as well as experimenting with fuels, as well as learning how to run a power reactor. Here's the reactor face before it ever went operational. The fueling machine at the time. So it would, here it is attached to the spent fuel port, and it would take fuel bundles. I think the channels were 5 meters long or 4 meters long in this reactor. There are the end fittings. You can see it from 132 fuel channels, and there are equivalent set the other end and fueling machine that end. And there are the feeders to the steam generator or from the pump. So the Canada reactor, Canada, sorry, better get this right. Canada deuterium uranium, not Canadian, it's Canada actually. Anyway, this fabulous built in Canada, designed in Canada, it's the reactor that could, still does, and will do for a long time to come. And it was named one of the top 10 engineering achievements of the past century. That was in 1987. And we're not a sunset industry. CANDU in Canada, NPD, Douglas Point, Pickering, Gentil 1 and 2, Bruce, Point Lepreau, Darlington. Gentil are out of operation. Douglas Point has been retired. NPD has been retired. But the other 4 sites are operational. CANDU around the world. You can see Canup, CGE built that. Wolsung, Envals, Chernavoda, Qinshan in China. Gifts to the world from the medical side of things. And there's up and coming CNL targeted alpha therapy, actinium-225, Bruce Power and Isogen working with lutetium-177, Bruce Power and Boston Scientific looking at yttrium-90, and Ontario Power Generation Moly-99 for technetium. And Bruce Power and I think OPG produce cobalt as well for irradiation equipment. 1980 physics continuing. Here we have the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory founding team under Art MacDonald. So they went from concept to reality to a giant sphere underground at Sudbury, filled acrylic sphere with photomultiplier tubes on the outside. It was filled with 1,000 tons of very pure heavy water, unused borrowed from AECL. Results, Nobel Prize in Physics. Now, Art is such a modest man. Of course, it comes naturally that he said the Nobel Prize, he happened to receive it, but really it was his whole team. And there are many more on that team. That's a wonderful, wonderful outcome. And of course, it led to an endorsement of trying to explain neutrinos using Timbits. Current status in Canada with OPG, we have Darlington refurb, which began in 2016. And you can see various states of it right now. 1 unit is being completed and restarted, and the project's on budget and on time. Darlington 1 happens to have the world record for a continuous run of any power reactor. And it was finally shut. They plan to finally shut down Darlington in 2055. At this time, possibility of having a second refurb in the future is there. Anyway, a possibility. Pickering, they plan to shut down the final units somewhere between 2024 to 2026, but there's a possibility of refurbishing Pickering B, as they call it, units 5 to 8, which are the newer reactors. Bruce Power, it has already restarted 2 reactors and refurbished 2 more. And then, so of the 8 they have at the Bruce site, they will refurbish, they're already refurbishing Unit 6, and Unit 3 was just shut down a few days ago on St. David's Day, March 1st. And they will plan to complete those refurbishments, which are very extensive, including steam generator replacement and the channels. And with time, they learn how better to do these projects. And so it's quite reasonable to expect them to be finished in 2033. And they're planning their final shutdown in 2064. Again, on budget, on time. New Brunswick Power, they refurbished their CANDU 6 reactor in 2012, and they're planning the final shutdown somewhere in the range of 2042 to 2047. Small modular reactors, SMRs, are very much in the news. There are 11 pre-licensing reviews underway at CNSC. There's an SMR action plan. The federal government is released this action plan, and a large number of organization and actions are involved there. OPG, Ontario Power Generation, is planning to build a GE Hitachi 300 megawatt boiling water reactor at Darlington site. Saskatchewan may follow suit. New Brunswick Power is working with two separate entities, talking about sodium-cooled fast breeder reactor for one, and a salt-cooled, molten salt-cooled reactor for the other design. Bruce Power is collaborating with utilities in exploring the possibilities of small modular reactors in the future. At the Chalk River site, a 5 megawatt electrical reactor is being planned for the site by Global First Power, which is between the U.S. Ultra Safe Nuclear Corporation in the United States with OPG. They formed Global First Power, and they are looking at building this on site, helium-cooled, small output, relatively, but it's really a prototype reactor with a molten salt reservoir to use heat later, using TRISO fuel, silicon carbide blocks, pellets, very small, about 1 millimeter in diameter, and they then put them into a silicon carbide matrix. Exciting stuff. Near surface disposal facility at Chalk River is being proposed, Chalk River, and it will include being able to take non-ACL or CNL waste from hospitals and universities. The biggest volume by far is from demolition waste, which is contaminated such that it can't be released to normal landfills. CNL is also proposing in situ burial for WR1 in Manitoba and NPD in Ontario. This is low and medium level waste. Of course, these reactors, the fuel has all been removed. They still have some areas which have been irradiated long enough that they have high fields, or moderately high fields anyway. And the Whiteshell site will be decommissioned by 2027. That's the plan. Nuclear Waste Management Organization is undertaking a long process to select a volunteer community for a deep geological repository for spent Canadian fuel. And they are down to a couple of locations, one in South Bruce, near the Bruce reactor site, and up in Ignis in Northern Ontario, north of Lake Superior. And they're working with these two places and doing site characterization. I think they had originally about 11 or 12 communities they were considering. So sort of getting to the end here, nuclear is about a lot of good people doing good work over the years. It's been a real pleasure on my part to have been part of this community, and I'm still hoping to contribute. This a plug for our own museum and collection, which we have in a building, thanks to ACL loaning us a building. We've been building up a collection of articles, and you can see some red underwear hanging from a wall there. A model of the NRX reactor, the bottom left corner there. And our extensive library collection, it's grown since then. And there is our facility, Deep River. So if you're ever coming up here, we're hoping to have regular opening hours, but do get in contact with us. We'll happily give people tours. So welcome to the future while we learn from the past. Here's a few websites, interesting places to go and visit for further information. And I'd like to just acknowledge all the sponsors of National Engineering Month. Should be perhaps Nuclear Engineering too. I noticed Queen's Engineering, where I did my undergrad, Ontario Power Generation, Bruce Power, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the bottom right-hand corner there.
You'd like to be troubled.
So thank you very much for listening, and I am open to questions.
But if you like to be troubled.
you have a question, you'll have to unmute yourself. I presume you can do that. My apologies for going on so long. They did give me 90 minutes, but normally I'm a little snappier than that. Well, if you you can also email me, and you can get go to our website, which is nuclearheritage.com or .ca. I think they both work, and you can send questions there. I've been dealing with a lot of questions recently over Jimmy Carter and his involvement with cleaning up the NRX accident. Well, thank you. Yes, Shadi.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Brown, for this excellent presentation. It was really informative. I'm a nuclear engineering student at the University of Ontario, Ontario Tech University. I just have a couple, one question here regarding SMRs. You brought up that Pickering, or it's pretty much the Darlington site, is planning on having the BWRX 300 from GE Hitachi. Now, since we don't have any previous experience from in terms of licensing small modular reactors, we do have that for large scale kind of reactors. How easy is the process of actually licensing? What's different here than giving a license to a large conventional reactor?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I don't think I could do it justice because I'm not a licensing specialist by any means. A new technology, and all these SMRs, there's a lot of new technology. None of them, I believe, there was SNC level, and we're talking about using essentially what was called the CANDU 3 for an SMR at one point, and that's essentially a CANDU. But I can't really answer that question. It's going to take a lot of effort on part of the CNSC and on part of the proponents to demonstrate that this reactor is safe, because people say, oh, it's a boiling water reactor. That was Fukushima. How have you overcome those things? They've learned a great deal from long before Fukushima about modern designs. So I'm sorry, I really can't answer that question about how it's different. It's going to be or it is a challenge for the CNSC in particular, because it's not CANDU technology, which is their expertise.
No, excellent. Thank you very much.
I'll pop up the chat. I noticed there's some questions here. I'm wondering how I came to compile such a thorough ensemble of Canadian nuclear history. Well, it's evolved over the years, this presentation. It began with one by Jeremy Whitlock, and some of his slides are essentially parts from his own presentation over the years. Just fascination. You're working in a site which is filled with history, and those of us who have a bent for history just love pursuing it. And I collected things. So that's a lot of books at our library are at our society library are discards that I picked up over the years. I'd love to make us a national nuclear museum and archives one day. Question on nuclear fusion. Well, that's an area which I'm very unfamiliar with, really. I think Canada is working with nuclear. There's General Fusion out in Vancouver, for instance, working on that. And we are now, CNL, Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, is also has a lot of expertise with tritium, because tritium is produced in CANDU reactors by neutrons interacting with heavy hydrogen in particular, much less so with light hydrogen has to be turned into heavy hydrogen to produce tritium. Anyway, there's a lot of expertise in tritium and at CNL, as well as in other hydrogen technologies. And so that I know is an ongoing part of CNL's work right now, is working on with various industrial partners looking to explore tritium as a fuel for fusion. just reading some of the questions. Question here, what education level would be usually required to work in designing nuclear reactors? A science degree, an engineering degree. Working in the research labs, a few years ago, they sort of edicted that, you must have a master's. I happen to have a master's in engineering because I couldn't get work when I had my bachelor's in 1985. So I went back to school and it was the best thing ever. I happened to work under tutelage of Dr. Terry Rogers at Carleton University, who I didn't realize at the time, but he was Dr. Severe Accidents and knew a great deal of nuclear stuff. Anyway, I happened to fall in with him and no turning back. So certainly a master's degree will be very valuable towards a master's or PhD degree towards working in the research field. Not necessarily necessary by any means. In the design work, I would think bachelor's and master's and some PhD as well would be, certainly I know there are lots of PhDs, say at Sheridan Park. Molten salt reactors in the future. Terrestrial energy, where are they based? Is it Mississauga? David LeBlanc, he was a lecturer at Carleton University, and he got a hold of a lot of the information about molten salt reactors, the MSRE experiments down in the United States. And he came up, I remember he gave presentations to the Canadian Nuclear Society in the early 2000s, soon after I'd moved from Manitoba to here. And it was sort of like, oh, this is interesting stuff, nice stuff, and sort of, but he was passionate about it. And they've really turned that into quite the company, pursuing molten salt reactors. And I couldn't say how far they've gone yet. I really don't know, but they're certainly one of the big players in SMRs and one of the big players in terms of new technologies, or shall we say out of the ordinary being water-cooled reactors and molten salt reactors. Yeah, I think there's definitely a future, and I think they can be used for actinide burning and reusing fuel from, say, CANDU reactors. Oh, hi, David. Oh, about the elaborate a bit on the Jimmy Carter role in the NRX cleanup. Yes, it's been in the news again. Was a couple of years ago. The story surfaces every now and then. You get gross exaggeration. And let me just say right from the beginning that I have a great deal of respect for Jimmy Carter. I don't know how good a president. I really just don't know. I'm ignorant of a lot of American politics, but certainly he seems like a delightful man, very much humanitarian. I have a great deal of respect for him. However, a lot of the story about his work here at Chalk River has been blown out of proportion. He was working at the Knolls Atomic Power Lab in New York State, which is a General Electric lab. He was working in the early 1950s as part of the nuclear submarine program under Admiral Rickover. And they were doing a lot, working at a lot of different labs. They actually were testing some fuel up here in the NRX reactor. They didn't really tell us what it was. It turned out to be uranium dioxide, UO2 fuel, being tested here because we could do it. So when there was an accident here, we have a speech of Admiral Rickover's from 1978 or 77, and he said that he asked permission of the Canadians to send some of his own team, his own crew members up here so they could learn about decontamination from what was really a very serious accident and contamination event. So he sent the team here, which was very useful because Canadian, mainly AECL staff, they were reaching their quarterly doses. And so the cleanup was needed some more people to work on it. And the Americans were most welcome, along with Canadian military. I think about 170 Canadians, 150 Americans came up here, helped with General cleanup, plus also they were given specific tasks, and Jimmy Carter was involved in removing upper and lower headers on the NRX reactor. He led a team of 12 men. They did their work, got suited up, did their work, probably reached their doses, quarterly doses or so, and then went back to the States after a couple of weeks here. And that's essentially the end of the story. Very much appreciate all the assisting all those very hardworking people here at AECL as well, in cleaning up the reactor, in restoring it, and eventually they rebuilt it and restarted within 14 months. And a lot of credit goes to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission as well, because AECL's experiments, which were now in hiatus because of the accident, they actually were able to pursue some of them down in the United States, keeping the research going. I see a comment here about Moltex. Yes, that's right. In New Brunswick, they're also working on molten salt reactors. Are there any other questions? Sorry, I can talk a lot, as you've probably guessed. Oh, yes, Shadi again.
Yes, thank you very much. One more question. You also mentioned some of the plans for Pickering, perhaps Darlington, by probably the year of 2055, they're going to shut down. Is there any particular plan that the nuclear industry in Canada right now is have or has in order to kind of offset shutdowning these reactors? Are they planning to build more, let's say, SMRs in the future if the Darlington experiment works, or is it going to be they're just going to shut it down and they're not going to build any new nuclear reactors?
Well, that's a tall question to ask. It's a very good question to ask, because we have a long time basis required for planning, designing, building reactors. They're not simple things to build in a hurry, even though the hope for small modular reactors is that they will become more like production units and will be easier to license and build, therefore taking a lot less time. 2055 for Darlington, 2064 for Bruce are the current estimates now of when they feel that they will have to, shut down their final CANDU units at those sites. I have seen comment from people that they are considering the possibility of even a second refurbishment of those reactors, if it's worthwhile in the future. I'm astonished, really, that these companies, OPG and Bruce Power, are so forward-thinking, and New Brunswick Power too. They're talking about things, not keeping operating until those days way in the future. I mean, this is what utilities have to do. They talk about hydro dams, for instance, lasting for even centuries. So I suppose I shouldn't be surprised when they think such long term. There are no plans, to my knowledge, of other than what we know right now for building SMRs, for instance, other than OPG is moving ahead as fast as it can on building the BWRX 300 at Darlington. Saskatchewan is definitely interested. They may make a decision by, I think it's around 2030, but make a decision by then, based on essentially what they see with Darlington. I think Alberta has also joined the Memorandum of Understanding on SMRs. Another province, I forget right now. Saskatchewan, Alberta, Ontario. Oh, New Brunswick, I think. They're the four who are pursuing SMRs. There's no long-term plan right now for what's going to replace those reactors. I think they're saying to themselves, look, we'll plan for that in the future. It's a long ways out, but they may be making now, utilities may be planning to build SMRs. Canada's utilities generally are pretty low carbon content anyway, except for remaining coal units in Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. we have a great deal of hydro and also a great deal of nuclear. So nuclear is somewhere in the order of, last year, I believe it's in the order of 55% of Ontario's electricity, for instance, and somewhere in the order of 30% for New Brunswick.
Thank you very much.
Well, I suppose since I see no more questions, but please feel free to contact me through nuclearheritage.com. And you can find the info at Nuclear Heritage or whatever our address is. I can't quite remember. Feel free to contact me through that and ask questions. And I'm in contact with some others who have knowledge in a lot of the fields which I know very little about. So I can certainly answer those questions that way. But thank you very much for being my audience today. It's been a real pleasure to share this really good story about what we've done here in Canada in the nuclear science technology world, from uranium mining to medical aspects, to power generation, to research, to industrial applications. We've done it all right here, and not forgetting waste disposal as well. So if you're part of that, oh, thank you. You put the website for reference, good. And if you choose a career in nuclear science and engineering, then good for you. It's been a great career for me. And I worked for 33 1/3 years, and now I'm working as a volunteer president of this history society, and I want to wave the flag, promote what has been done here in Canada, with a jaundiced view, of course, because not everything went the way it should. So good night to you all, and I guess that's it.